Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Sincerest apologies for the delay in starting the webinar. We unfortunately had some technical issues, but we are very thankful to everybody who's joined us this afternoon for our webinar on keeping safe in the field, how to mitigate risk during difficult research. Please just, if you're having any difficulty hearing us, please just send a message in the group chat. My name is Vanessa Malila. I'm a Research and Development Officer at the Humanitarian Academy for Development, and I'll be chairing the webinar this afternoon. This is the first webinar of what we hope will be a series of very interesting and informative webinars being hosted by the Academy, the Humanitarian Academy for Development, which hopes to bring together practitioners, academics, students, civil society organizations, to try and explore some of the key issues in the humanitarian and development sector at the moment. So I'm going to start with just a brief introduction of the three presenters, and then we'll have the presentations and we'll have a short Q&A at the end. I would ask that if you do have questions, please target them to the particular presenter, and we'll take note of them and try and then answer them at the end of the three presentations. So today's webinar really comes out of the context of trends in research on international development and violent conflict, which often take place under difficult circumstances. Often as researchers, we go into a community with the aim of producing research that will have positive benefits. However, the context can sometimes adversely affect the physical, emotional, and mental well-being of research participants, of the researchers themselves, and also of the wider community, which means that research may have unintended negative consequences. Risks can be particularly high in situations of violent conflict or humanitarian crises, and when working with vulnerable or marginalized communities. While these challenges should not deter us from doing research to better understand difficult contexts, the resources we draw on should be appropriate. Often, the fact that research ethics guidelines for practitioners and academics are written from a Western perspective or a Western understanding of development means that these resources are not appropriate for a lot of our contexts. What this webinar aims to do is highlight the risks of doing research in challenging contexts and explore what measures can be taken to mitigate those risks. Our first presentation is from Dr. Jennifer Eghert, who is the Head of Research and Development at the Humanitarian Academy for Development. Jennifer has worked as a researcher and practitioner in the sector since 2002. And before joining HAD, Jennifer worked at the University of Warwick and Oxford Brookes University. Her areas of expertise include gender, political violence, migration, and development. In her presentation, she'll be discussing the risks faced by researchers. Her discussion will draw on her experience as a researcher and practitioner in the Middle East, South Asia, and the Balkans, and examine the mental, emotional, and physical risks faced by researchers in the field. Our second presentation is by Kathleen Rutledge, who's a humanitarian worker who's worked in the sector for nearly a decade. She's currently undertaking a PhD with the Institute for Global Health and Development at Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh. Her areas of expertise include their religious experience of suffering amongst Muslim populations impacted by violent conflict. In her presentation, Kathleen will be examining the risks faced by research participants. She will draw on her extensive experience as a practitioner and researcher working with women affected by ISIS in Iraq to examine the importance of ethical research and some of the practical considerations which can be used to ensure the safety and well-being of research participants are taken into account. Our last presentation is by Dr. Janaka Jayawikrama, who is Associate Professor in Community Wellbeing in the Health Sciences Department at the University of York. His work has a particular focus on understanding the well-being of communities with uncertainty and the dangers presented by disasters, conflict, and uneven development. In his presentation, Janaka will be examining the challenges created by research in crisis-affected communities, particularly when the researcher is an outsider who might not fully be aware of the realities on the ground. His presentation will highlight the importance of understanding context and participation when doing research in crisis-affected communities. So I'll hand over to Jennifer, who will begin the first presentation.
Okay, thank you, Vanessa. And hello, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Yeah, so I'm going to pre-fine my presentation than I had planned, just to allow for enough time for Q&A in the end. So in terms of what I'd speak about is I have prepared a slide on my background, just so that you have get an idea of where I'm coming from. I'll largely skip that because obviously Vanessa has provided quite a good introduction already. And then there is three things that I would like to focus on in my presentation. First of all, why do we need to look at safety in the field of the researcher, and then the need to move from focusing on physical safety only to also include mental and emotional well-being, and lastly, a couple of words on why context matters. So I'll just skip that slide because Vanessa has already covered it. So the first point that I wanted to make is that historically there has often been a focus on the protection and inclusion of research participants. In most debates on research ethics, this is really what most people who participate in these debates have focused on. And that is important, and I'm not arguing here to shift the focus from the research participants to the researcher at the expense of the research participants. But what I'm trying to say that it is also important to take into account the roles and experiences of the researchers themselves, who, yes, have a responsibility towards research participants, but also towards themselves. So it's really a multidimensional approach that I'm arguing for here, that takes into account the researcher and their role, research participants, and then also the wider context and community, which is why we decided to structure this webinar in the way that we approach it here today. Now, all of these different levels, they obviously so research ethics and taking people's safety and well-being into account will play out in different ways on all of these levels, which is something that we as researchers or research managers need to take into account when planning research, but also when implementing and analyzing it. So the second point I wanted to make is that, and again, I look at this from the perspective what was how debates on this and practice as well has by what it has been dominated in the past. There's often been a focus on physical well-being only. So in a lot of research ethics guidelines, there's a lot of talk about, okay, how can you make sure that your physical health is not affected. And one example for this is probably my own field research in Lebanon, where I had to explain to my host university here in the UK how I was planning to keep safe and how I was not going to get killed or maimed or kidnapped. But there was much less focus on my mental and emotional well-being in the field, which is a question that, especially if you work on difficult issues, as a lot of us in the who work on development, humanitarian aid, and violent conflict do, it's just something that also needs to be taken into account. One aspect in this context is that there's often reluctance to discuss emotional mental well-being. So I've heard so many academics who do difficult field research tell their hero stories from the field and how amazing it was when that night they cruised the streets of Kabul under the Afghani moonshine, and it all sounds very exciting, but I feel that these stories are often quite dishonest because there's just something missing, and that is that difficult research in difficult circumstances can really have an impact on your emotional well-being. Now, in terms of what helps, I feel that first step is always to be aware of the situation, to be aware of the issues, to be aware of what could potentially come up, and then just be in exchange with others who are in similar situations, be in exchange with people who understand, and quite often that can be colleagues. I feel that sometimes it can actually be a better idea not to speak, to share too many details with family or with friends, because it can just be a bit overwhelming for them too, and you'll just end up getting them really worried, which will then stress you out even more. Whereas if you speak with someone who's also done this fieldwork in places like, I don't know, Kabul or Karachi or wherever else your research might take you, then this can be much more beneficial. And the last point is about taking breaks. So you can, especially if you're not constantly, permanently based in the field and you're only there for a couple of weeks or months, which is the reality for many researchers, then you can often feel like you need to do as much as possible in as little time as possible, which can then lead to you forgetting that you actually do need a break, and it can actually be really beneficial to take a break. Yeah. And then lastly, really important point is context, and that context matters, and that there's just no simple solutions that will work for everyone in this context. So who is at risk and to what extent and in what ways will very much depend on who the researcher is, what her research entails, where she does her research, who the research participants are, and so on. And I feel that it's really, really important in this context to take an intersectional approach, because your specific experience will be affected by your previous experience, but also by personal identifiers such as gender, origin, where you come from, race, face, class, language, and so on. And again, I'll give a quick example from my work in Lebanon. So I was a foreigner, I was a European, and people could clearly tell. So they treated me like a foreigner sometimes, but then I wore hijab, so I was clearly Muslim. So that also affected how people viewed me, how they interacted with me, how they treated me, and how I felt in the field. A lot of the people I engaged with had quite negative views of Muslims, especially practicing Muslims, so headscarf, right? Was a bit of a barrier sometimes, but then I was a foreigner, which again worked in my favor. I spoke French, which kind of made me a good Muslim rather than a good and educated Muslim, rather than a bad, uneducated, extreme Muslim. So all of these things affected how I felt in the field. And then last point probably, and this has already come up a little bit in Vanessa's introduction, is that yes, we have official research guidelines and they are very important, and they can also be helpful, but they do not always match the realities on the ground. And I'm sure this is something that will also come up in Kathleen's and Janaka's presentation. So I feel it is important to have these research ethics guidelines and to abide by them as much as possible, but sometimes you need flexibility, and then it's a very difficult but also important process to figure out where how flexibility you need and at what time, in what context. And I leave it at that.
Great, thank you very much, Jennifer. I think that was really useful insights into quite practical examples of protecting yourself as a researcher, and in quite difficult context. I'm going to hand over now to Kathleen, who will go through her presentation on protecting research participants. Thanks, Kathleen.
Great. Hi. Thanks, everybody, for your patience and for staying with us. I am going to be talking about protecting research participants and how to minimize and mitigate risks that they face from participating in our research. If I can, there we go. I'm going to be talking essentially about do no harm and well-being of participants. Going to be looking at when our research is justified and time-based issues related to that, the concerns related to direct benefit in fragile contexts and aid contexts in particular, informed consent, some of the practicals of planning that we can look at in terms of protection and our responsibilities after the research. The first thing is essentially, we often think that mitigating the risk happens during the interviews, or as we are talking about consent, and afterwards in terms of referrals. However, I think that most of the actual preparation, most of the risk mitigation happens in advance before we actually start our research. And the starting point across, in a lot of disciplines is, first, do no harm. So we've got humanitarian disciplines, academics, development, other types of practitioners. And widely it's accepted that we want to make sure that our research does not increase vulnerability or in any way have an adverse effect on the population. And the first place to start with this, there are, in terms of actual research, there are, laws and guidelines that usually regulate research in each country, particularly formal research. So I've put a resource later on that you can look at that has, can summarize for you what the laws are in the particular countries where you may be doing research. However, a lot of research, particularly, the informal assessments, monitoring, evaluations in the field, don't have the formal restrictions or the guides. And so this is where our internal and personal commitments to the ethical aspects of our engagement come into play, and to abide by the international commitments as well to do no harm. However, I'd suggest that do no harm is a great starting point and critical, but perhaps not enough. So one way to reframe this is to look instead at putting the well-being of the research participant first as the central consideration in our planning and our decision-making, even down to day-to-day. Do I continue with this participant or not, or are they demonstrating too much distress? Do I work in this area of population? Do I not? What timing? So I'm borrowing here from what is the foundational statement, really, from more of the medical research community, and it's increasingly broadening out to other disciplines as well. But I really like what they have said here. It's basically the Hippocratic Oath reformed. And what I'm looking at, just pick out a couple of words, that the well-being of the participant, the first consideration, respecting autonomy and dignity, utmost respect for life, that we respect the secrets that are confided, that we practice with dignity and good practice, and we give the respect and gratitude that is due to research participants. So this reframes the vision and can help be a guide. 3 things we need to look at here. We do need to do research in fragile contexts. We do need to do research in conflict, post-conflict, natural disaster settings, because we need to look at the interventions. We need to understand the population priorities. We want to make sure we're doing appropriate and effective, engagement. So it is important. But also we need to ask ourselves this question, a self-reflection question. Is what I'm doing in this place, in this manner, and with this population needed right now to achieve the goal? There are certain times in the response or in context where the vulnerability and the distress is at a place where, research may be adding to that and increasing that, and it may not be necessary at that point to achieve the goal. There is also a guiding principle I find helpful that, here's this quote here, that research into human suffering ought to only be justifiable if it contributes to the end of that suffering. And I'm particularly talking again about human suffering. So there are a lot of different types of research, I know. But when we're going in that route, we need to ask ourselves, what is the goal? Who does benefit in that way? One of the most significant and frequent things I hear in the field is the distress and disillusionment that people feel by being assessed over and over and over particularly in the early stages in certain contexts by multiple agencies. And there's confusion, and people get upset because they say, look, I just talked to this agency that I need window frames because winter's coming. They said, great, we'll get back to you. Never came back. And this is so frequent and very common. And this is difficult. There is chaos in the beginning, but it's up to us to increase our coordination to the degree possible. And if we hear those types of things, to go back and connect with the other agencies involved, the other researchers involved, and try to bring that to advocate. There's just a couple things here that I'll let you look at. One is, as you know, working in some of these contexts, they're active humanitarian contexts, and separating yourself out, what's the difference between a researcher and the actual aid workers is difficult. So you can look at some of the points here. I'll just give you a chance to glance at these. So we can, in terms of, we look indistinguishable from aid workers. We roll up in the the SUVs, and we look exactly the same. And so it's absolutely critical to be as clear as possible in repeating it, that the separation from aid and that there may not be a direct benefit, but we also can boost the benefit. We can be committed to sharing the findings externally, to the degree, obviously, that respects the confidentiality. We can share it in cluster meetings. We can share finders with other agencies. We can go to camp managers and advocate. So there is something we can do. And also just informed consent, to be aware of the impact and ramifications that the person giving consent may face. They might not be fully aware of what they may face when they go back to their family and they say, what were you doing? The husbands, perhaps, if you're researching with women in certain contexts, saying, what were you doing? Security people looking at the same thing. So I think it's critical. If you just look at the clarity, you work in some of these remote villages with huts and mainly pastoral groups. We go in there saying the words informed consent. I think it's important for us to go, okay, let's connect with the local concepts of this and just make sure we're really giving the people the power to give to us and share with us what they are comfortable with. We'll move quickly through this. I'll just let you look at these and say quickly, that, again, before the research, investing in our research teams. Are they putting well-being first? This is really difficult in humanitarian and development assessments and that sort of thing. We just don't do the same things. We do, releases for photos, but we don't do the rest. And I think there's more we could be doing related to communication and confidentiality and informed consent. We need to train our teams. Is our project really locally shaped? Are we picking the times of day that are appropriate? The locations, are we doing the time for the tea that's important for that? Perhaps the family to be able to feel empowered. We'll also face pressure sometimes for, the authorities to report back on what, oops, sorry, I think it went forward without me. Anyway, to report back, can I go back one? Anyway, to report back on what we found. And I think, we need to resist that, and it's difficult. So moving on to this slide, this is also, in addition to the one I mentioned about please stop assessing us. I recently, in the research in Iraq, the strongest thing and most repeated thing that women said was, please no pictures, please no pictures. I keep, they found their own pictures on Facebook, it's not, they hadn't gotten permission, people hadn't gotten permission for those. So I think as researchers, we need to clarify when the communications are needed, and when the communications department are pressing for those things and need those things, how do we, when is that appropriate? When can we separate that out? And again, we don't want to steal stories and increase danger. We want to respect the population. Yeah, last slide. Just to mention here that I think the other aspect is, it's really easy to not come back. And I think in terms of what we would want to, have some feedback. And so when it's possible and when it's feasible, to be able to come back and share, here are the findings, or here's some feedback on what we learned. And again, to be committed to share that with external power brokers and decision makers. These last 3 points, I'll let you look at some of the readings if you want to follow up on them. Basically, there is a lot of research talking about what's the long-term moral relationship with research participants. There's discussion on participatory action research concepts. So there's a lot out there to guide in a more in that perspective, if that's something you're interested in. Lastly, here is the slide of the references. Some of them I've mentioned, and some address some of the latter things that I've discussed on the last slide. There is also, if I can get it to go forward, here's some of the guidelines that I'd mentioned. The one at the top is the compilation of the 131 countries. It shows the laws and regulations, and the others are just statements and other guides that might be helpful. Lastly, there are some specifically related to research in the Arab region, particularly the book at the top, and I hope that will be useful. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathleen, for a very comprehensive, I think, view of some of the threats, some of the dangers, some of the challenges of doing research and needing to be more cognizant of those. We're going to hand over now to Janako, who's going to wrap up with his presentation. Then hopefully we will have a few minutes left for questions. So if I can just remind everyone who's joining us to please send through questions on the group chat, so that we can have some questions at the end. Thank you. Over to you, Janaka. Just a second.
Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. And I'm Janaka, and I'm from Sri Lanka. So I'm going to talk to you about a worm's eye view about research and research happening on the ground in humanitarian situations. Okay, so this presentation, basically, I'm going to talk some experiences of crisis affected communities with research and researchers, but also what I'm presenting here are not necessarily absolute truth, but for your critical thinking. And finally, we need to think about why we are doing research and who should get the benefit of our research. Yeah, so why do we do research? So in the humanitarian perspective, for policies, for planning, for distributing assistance, but also importantly and increasingly, we are using research to measure the relevance, impact, effectiveness, efficiency, and sustainability of humanitarian responses. However, when we think about affected populations and the external researchers coming in, what we most of the time forget about is that most of the affected populations have been living through disasters, conflicts, and so many uncertainties and dangers for their generations. And they look at those issues and crises through their lived experiences and understandings, but also through their religious, cultural, and traditional explanations. So again, we need to understand how can the affected population understand research, because if the people themselves, so the participants themselves, can't understand what you are doing as a researcher, then there is a problem. In that, I'm going to talk very quickly about ethical, methodological, logistical, and political domains of research, which originally developed by Colin Dogan and Kenneth Bush in 2013 as a framework, but also it's been in discussion, especially among humanitarian researchers over the last 20-25 years now. So when we look at these domains, when we talk about reliance on research methodology that disappear key stakeholders, is not just a methodological issue, but also an ethical issue. And then lack of access to stakeholders that compromise your methodological integrity, which is very much about logistics. And similarly, when researchers only allowed to meet certain groups of people or successful projects, it's a political issue. And then you get to the research commissioners who are pressurizing the researchers to publish against the data, which is again an ethical issue. So you could see the connection in many different ways. If I talk about ethical elements of research, what we need to remember is that what looks wrong from outside may not necessarily be wrong from inside. To give you an example, after the tsunami in Sri Lanka, there were so many mental health researchers who came to interview the affected populations. However, within the Sri Lankan community ethics, if you like, people don't necessarily talk about their feelings and emotions to unknown outsiders. So what happened in some cases was the researchers labeling the affected populations as traumatized without understanding the cultural, social, and religious elements of it. And then you come to the methodological elements. Again, there are two aspects to think about. First one is the humanitarian responses or humanitarian context are very much to do with care. What we need to understand in that is the affected populations are the first responders to any disaster or a crisis. And in that sense, most researchers not understanding the context and the way people care for each other becomes a challenge. For example, after the 2005 Pakistan earthquake, the mental health researchers actually arrived before even the food aid arrived on the ground. So people were hungry and the winter was coming and cold and all of that. The researchers were busy running around gathering their data. Then the logistical element is to do with the time, insecurity, geography, and access. And again, these are around understanding the practicalities of accessing the communities, practicalities of allowing the affected populations to be more flexible, more free to engage with the research process. And the political element is quite important to think about because it is not just the bigger picture politics, but also at the very local level politics that we need to understand. So I would like to quickly read a quotation from a theological professor from Rwanda who was a refugee in Malawi in 2006. What the researchers should think about is that we are also living human beings. These are our lives, and making dishonest judgments about our situations is unethical and immoral. I don't know how they sleep at night. Conducting social research is not just a job, but a responsibility towards the research participants. With all the good intentions, you can still damage us. So when we think about ethical, political, methodological, and logistical domains, they don't separately function. It's an amalgamation of all these different aspects. So if you are conducting research in conflict-affected, disaster-affected societies, here are my 3 takeaway points. First one is the importance of research used through transparency, accountability, and participation. How do you establish your research governance is an important aspect. And secondly, the importance of ethical, methodological, political, and logistical domains in producing high quality research. So your planning, your preparation, but also readings of that place you are going to, their histories, the colonialities, and all of that is very important. And finally, importance of paying careful attention to context and local communities. Whether we like or not, the affected populations are the experts of their lives. As one of my colleagues from Eastern Sri Lanka told a UN country representative in Sri Lanka is, my dear sir, this may be your project, but this is my life. So basically, that's what I have to say. And here are some references that you could look up and read further about what I mentioned. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Janica. That was a really insightful presentation. I think all three presentations have really provided excellent insights, not only from practical experiences in the field and in particular contexts, but also highlighting some of the key issues at a more kind of conceptual level as well, to do with research ethics and understanding your positionality as a researcher and somebody who holds power when you go into particular contexts. Unfortunately, we are very limited in terms of time. So I'm going to, rather than asking questions directed at each of the presenters, I'm going to ask one question, and I'll give 1 minute to each of the presenters to answer the question. So my question is thinking about the future of research. And future generations of researchers and practitioners going out into challenging contexts. What can universities be doing differently? What can they be doing better to ensure that future researchers, future generations are better equipped to go out into the field, to ensure that they understand risks to themselves, to communities, to participants, and how to better mitigate those kinds of risks, and to really have that kind of lens of some of the things that you've spoken about. How do we equip future researchers and academics and practitioners to do that better? So I'm going to start with Jennifer, and then I'll hand over to Kathleen and Janica to hopefully give us your insights on what you think universities can be doing differently. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Vanessa. So I think what the situation is at the moment is that universities are increasingly starting to understand what the issue is, and that we really need to think more about research ethics and how to keep researchers and research participants in the field safe. There's very little talk about research. There's very little talk about the impact on wider communities, unfortunately. But at least with regards to research and research participants, we're starting to finally get there in terms of awareness. Unfortunately, I feel that at the moment the situation is often that universities, they hide a bit behind their research ethics guidelines, and they don't provide much more beyond that. So they either refer to the guidelines, or they will just stop people from going to the field. And sometimes this can be overly cautious, because I think there are situations where it actually would be possible to conduct this research with the proper support. And that proper support is often missing. What I think we need is more research training for universities, for the academics who supervise students who do this kind of work in the field, plus the academics themselves, obviously, or at least those with limited experience. And I can speak for the UK in particular, because that's where most of my academic career has taken place. There is hardly anyone who offers this kind of training.
Great, thank you.
Sorry.
Thanks, Kathleen. I'll hand over to you.
Brilliant. Yeah, so I'll just jump in quickly. I think there are 3 things we can do. First of all, there's really good training out there in terms of risk assessment, risk mitigation, and keeping yourself safe in the field. There are groups like Clarity and Safer World, and these kinds of things, some agencies bring in that kind of training for even a day. If people are going to be in the field longer, there are 4- and 5-day trainings that provide amazing skills, but even just a day, and those are not very expensive, and they can be almost life-saving. I mean, definitely life-saving in some cases. Another thing is that in a lot of contexts, particularly the higher risk contexts, there are security groups. Often there's a couple called INSO and other UN security groups. So there's constant updates, constant information going around. And if it's possible for academic institutions to link with what already exists, you can keep real-time information coming in the entire time that you're in the field. And lastly, there's a possibility to link with agencies locally, even if they're not particularly related to the research, but people on the ground who will be more plugged in and will know that when the temperature changes in the local environment, and will be able to provide some of that support. So I think practically there's just a lot out there, and we need to link in with what's there. That's it. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you, Kathleen. Can I hand over now to Janica just to give us his final thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I think I'm coming from a little bit of a different angle, especially trying to look at the community themselves, because when we look at the current knowledge production process, i.e. research, which is induction and deduction, is very European, North American. However, in African, Asian, Middle East, and Latin American context, there are very different research methodologies, research knowledge foundations that are there. And unfortunately, the universities are becoming more and more European, North American centric. So in a very colonial or post-colonial framework, we are expecting the researchers, even that are coming from non-European, non-North American countries, to be like European, be like North American. So that's a big problem. I think on the ground, that creates a lot of problem. I think the universities, if they want to do effective and relevant research, they need to think about how they can incorporate non-European wisdoms against knowledge in knowledge production processes, because these are the lived realities of people. And also, as I mentioned earlier, the communities have lived through disasters, conflicts since the beginning of the human history. Through that, they have developed very sophisticated yet pragmatic methodologies to deal with them. We need to understand that, and that needs to be thought through. And that's not just an educational research process, but also a social, political, cultural, and economic battle or a struggle. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Janica. And thank you to all of our presenters. Thank you to all of our participants. Unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions or final thoughts, but we'd like you to keep posted of the HAD website, and we will keep you updated of any future webinars. As I said, this is the first in a series of webinars that we are hoping to have, and we'd greatly appreciate any feedback that you have. Thank you to everyone, and good afternoon.